What do you think the United Nations, the United States, the West, UK should be doing right now?
Well, I think there is an obligation on the part of all member states of the United Nations, including those states in the West, to respond in accordance with their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law. My central point in the most recent letter was that we had effectively left international law behind when the international community embraced the Oslo process, which sort of raised up notions of political expediency above the requirements of international law. And that was a real loss for human rights in Palestine. I think there is an obligation on the part of all states, not just to respect international humanitarian law and international human rights law, but under the Geneva Conventions to ensure respect. And it's clear that many states, including the United States itself, have are not only in breach of their obligation to ensure respect vis-a-vis those states over which they have influence, in this case Israel, but have been actively complicit, actively engaged in arming and diplomatic cover, in political support, intelligence support, and so on. That is a breach of international humanitarian law. We need the opposite of that. We need all states, members of the United Nations, to use whatever influence they have to ensure an end to these attacks on civilians in Gaza, to ensure as well accountability for the perpetrators, redress for the victims, protection for the vulnerable there. It's interesting, Amy, we have a formula at the United Nations that is applied to virtually every other conflict situation. But when it comes to the situation in Israel and Palestine, there's a different set of rules, apparently. And that's, I think, a big source of my frustration. Where is the transitional justice process? Where is the UN protection force to protect all civilians? Where is the tribunal for accountability? Where is the action on the part of the Security Council, the only mechanism in the United Nations that has enforcement to ensure protection in the occupied territories? Obviously, every effort in the Security Council is vetoed by the United States itself, and further indication of the kind of complicity about which I am referring. And I think the other thing that needs to happen in the international community is that we have to abandon the failed paradigms of the past on a political level and get back to the roots, which is international law, international human rights. What has happened in the context of the so-called Oslo process, the two-state solution, the UN quartet, is that they have acted effectively as a smokescreen behind which we have seen further and worsening dispossession of Palestinians, massive atrocities such as those as we are witnessing now, the loss of homes and land, further settlement activity. It's an open secret inside the halls of the United Nations that the so-called two-state solution is effectively impossible now. There's nothing left for a sustainable state for the Palestinian people, and takes no account of the fundamental human rights of the Palestinian people. The new paradigm has to be one based upon equality of all people there, equal rights for Christians, Muslims, and Jews, and that needs to be the new approach. And I think as well, it's interesting that this year we are commemorating the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted in 1948. That same year, the Nakba occurred in Palestine and apartheid was adopted in South Africa. We have seen, because of a consistent international law and international human rights approach in the UN and the international community, that apartheid in South Africa fell. We did not take the same approach in Palestine. We've deferred to these political processes, and as a result, not only have we not seen an end to the oppression of the Palestinian people, we've seen a continuing worsening of the situation.
So you're a longtime human rights lawyer. I want you to respond. I played this already for Yousef Hamash in Gaza right now, in Khan Yunis, to respond. But I'd like you to respond to it as well. After Israel's attack on Jabalia yesterday, the IDF spokesperson, Israeli Defense Force spokesperson, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hecht, appeared on CNN and was interviewed by Wolf Blitzer.
But you know that there are a lot of refugees, a lot of innocent civilians, men, women, and children in that refugee camp as well, right?
This is the tragedy of war, Wolf. I mean, as you know, we've been saying for days, move south. Civilians that are not involved with Hamas, please move south.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get a little bit more information. You knew there were civilians there, you knew there were refugees, all sorts of refugees, but you decided to still drop a bomb on that refugee camp attempting to kill the Hamas commander. By the way, was he killed?
I can't confirm yet. There'll be more updated. Yes, we know that he was killed. About the civilians there, we're doing everything we can to minimize.
So he's saying they're doing everything they can to minimize. He's talking about Ibrahim Biari, whom Israel's identified as Hamas's commander of the Jabalia Center Battalion, saying that he was killed in those recent strikes. Can you respond to every aspect of what he said? They were trying to get a high-value target, as they put it, and they are not trying to kill civilians.
Well, I think what's important in that interview is that is another of many indications of intent on the part of Israeli authorities that will be very important in a court of law. He has said very openly that they knew of the concentrations of civilians there, and yet, in violation of the principle of distinction in international humanitarian law, and on the pretext of killing one combatant, wiped out the better part of an entire refugee camp, densely populated refugee camp. And I think what's been interesting in this war is the very open statement of intents. I referred in my letter to the case for genocide, which is happening now. And you know, genocide is a very politicized term, often abused. But in this case, the hardest part of proving genocide has been proven for us with these very open statements of genocidal intent by Israeli officials, including the prime minister and the president and senior cabinet ministers and military officials, who in their public statements have indicated very clearly their intention not to distinguish between civilians and combatants and to carry out the kinds of wholesale slaughter that we are witnessing in Gaza. That is not a justification in international law, saying that there was a combatant there for that very disproportionate use of firepower against what was a civilian target. And that's what we've been seeing in all of Gaza, from the north to the south. The other thing is this claim that, well, we told them to move south, and therefore we can kill everybody who didn't move. This is an extremely dangerous and unlawful tactic that is being used. First, because we know that evacuations in Gaza, in the best of times, in this densely populated, small territory with 2.3 million civilians crowded in, with very limited infrastructure, is a huge challenge. But most of Gaza has been bombed into rubble. It is just not physically possible for civilians to move en masse in the ways that Israel has required them to do so. And we know, already well documented, that when they do so, they're still subjected to bombings even in the south of the Gaza Strip. So all of this, it seems to me, is evidence of intent and a prima facie case for violations of the laws of war.